Iron Man 3 is going to be a little tough to talk about for me. Once I got home from the theater after seeing it, I wrote down a bunch of notes about it, and it ended up being about 4 pages, and they're all negative things. This isn't like a script for this video, it's just like a bunch of scattered complaints about the movie in different sections of the movie, so why don't we just hop right in. Firstly, before you continue watching, just let it be known that this is a spoiler-filled review of Iron Man 3, so if you haven't seen Iron Man 3 yet and you don't want any of the juicy details spoiled for you, this is the time to stop watching this video. I have a few main central problems with Iron Man 3, but I think the best way to sum up the biggest flaws in the movie is that it's not the concepts, it's the execution. I could stand here for 5 minutes and describe to you the plot of Iron Man 3, and it would probably sound awesome, because it does sound awesome, but it's only within the context of the movie that none of that stuff works. A big plot thread in the movie deals with Tony Stark losing his mind and going a little bit crazy over the events that happened in the Avengers. He begins having all these random anxiety attacks and he starts freaking out all the time without warning, and that's because of the things that happened in the Avengers messing with his brain. Again, in theory that sounds cool, in the trailers it looked cool, but when you really think about it, it doesn't really work or add up. Over the course of the Iron Man movies and the Avengers movie, a lot has happened to Tony Stark and it never seems to affect him at all. Even in the Avengers, when Tony Stark goes through that wormhole hugging the nuke into deep space, it's not even really a big deal within the context of the movie. Sure, it's sort of dramatic for 5 seconds, but then they make a joke out of it. So when he starts freaking out all the time for no reason in Iron Man 3, you just keep thinking, wait, why? It wasn't even a big deal when it happened. Again, in theory, Tony Stark being vulnerable and starting to go a little bit nuts is pretty cool because he usually brushes off intense situations with humor, but in the context of the movie, it just doesn't work. It's difficult to explain. If you saw any of the trailers for Iron Man 3 before going to see it, then you probably got really excited for it, like me, because the trailers are awesome. Those trailers do what good trailers should do. They show you a lot of cool, action-y stuff from the movie, but they only show you what are then seemingly small pieces of what's yet to come. You go to see Iron Man 3 because you expect the cool stuff that you took away from the trailer to be expanded upon and go further, but in the movie it doesn't. As a matter of fact, I think the only cool scene that I saw in the trailer that I was actually satisfied with after I saw the movie was the scene where Tony Stark's house gets blown up. Otherwise, it's just, there's no payoff. There's a scene in the movie that's featured in almost all the Iron Man 3 trailers, and that's a scene where Robert Downey Jr. and Gwyneth Paltrow are laying in bed together at night, and then an Iron Man suit comes and grabs Pepper Potts. When you're watching the trailer, that scene looks awesome because it only shows you a little snippet of it. It doesn't show you what actually happens with the scene. It gets you pumped up to see the movie, you know? You want to see how that scene plays out, but in the context of the movie, nothing happens. Tony's having nightmares, and then he wakes up and immediately disables the thing, and that's the end of the scene. There's also a scene in the trailer where you see Tony Stark in some kind of operating room, and it looks really neat at first glance, but that ends up being just kind of a confusing throwaway scene at the end of the movie. What's going on in that operating room is he's getting the arc reactor in his chest removed, which is weird to me because I thought the reason Tony Stark super upgraded the arc reactor in the first place was because there was no way to remove the shrapnel in his chest. Allegedly, there's a small scene in the Chinese cut of Iron Man 3 that explains this complaint away, but I can't verify that for you because I'm not in China. Anyways, there's a lot of scenes like that in Iron Man 3. You go into the movie with all this cool stuff in your head, and in the context of the movie, there's no real payoff, or there's a stupid payoff for it, like that whole army of Iron Men that you see in the trailer, or Tony Stark dragging that suit through the snow, or the Mandarin. The Mandarin. If there's anything positive that I will say about Iron Man 3, it's that the marketing for it was pretty genius. The big twist in the movie is that the Mandarin is a decoy hired by Guy Pearce, who is the real bad guy. However, all the clever advertisements for this movie barely featured Guy Pearce, and they were very, very Ben Kingsley Mandarin-centric. All the trailers and TV spots and posters for Iron Man 3 advertised that Ben Kingsley was going to be playing the main villain, the Mandarin. The marketing for the movie was really clever. It was so fixated on advertising Ben Kingsley as the main villain that I actually forgot that Guy Pearce was in the movie, and that's interesting when you consider that he's the main villain in the thing. The idea that the ads for Iron Man 3 would give you one thing so that you'd be that much more surprised when you saw the twist in the actual movie is a cool idea, but with Iron Man 3, it's not the concepts, it's the execution. I actually think the trailers and the ads do a much better job of building up Ben Kingsley as the actual bad guy than the movie does. It's about halfway through the movie when you find out that the Mandarin is just a decoy for Guy Pearce, but until then, he is in your brain as like the definite bad guy for this movie. But until that halfway mark, just about every aspect in the movie fails at building him up as a good bad guy. I think the main reason for that is because he gets barely any screen time until that halfway mark. Before Tony Stark meets Ben Kingsley about halfway through the movie, all you see of the Mandarin are him starring in these threatening terrorist videos directed at America. Seeing the Mandarin presented like this in the movie made me think they were going to go for some sort of Star Wars angle, like with Emperor Palpatine. In the Star Wars trilogy, you never actually see the Emperor until Return of the Jedi. In A New Hope and Empire, you hear about him a lot, people talk about him a lot, but you never actually see him, and this builds him up in your mind as like the biggest, baddest thing in the universe, so that when you actually see him, he's that much scarier. But Star Wars is a trilogy. That's 3 movies. That's a lot of time to build up the big main villain as the scariest thing out there. Whereas in Iron Man 3, you have about 45 minutes until that big twist is going to happen, and there's already tons of other plot threads weaved into this movie, so Ben Kingsley doesn't have any time to develop develop. There's simply not enough time in the movie to build up the Mandarin in your mind as a force to be reckoned with. He's just sort of there. And Ben Kingsley, weirdly enough, didn't do much to make me question this point. He wasn't very good. You'd figure they'd hire Ben Kingsley to play the Mandarin in this movie because he's an established actor, you know? He could command an awesome presence on screen. But he just doesn't, like, at all. I think part of the reason for that is because he gets, like, no screen time until the big twist, but I think another part of that is just because of him. You know, in the first scene in The Dark Knight Rises, when you see Bane for the first time, you know nothing about him, but he's still kind of terrifying to you. He just commands this sort of evil, foreboding presence. You never really feel that with the Mandarin. Perhaps if the Mandarin was actually the villain for the entire movie, they would have more time to develop him, and then he could have been a cooler villain. But instead, behind the curtain is actually Guy Pearce, who's not any better. This big twist in Iron Man 3 pissed off a lot of people because it basically claimed that the Mandarin does not exist in the world of Marvel movies. I'm just here for the movies. I've never read an Iron Man or Avengers comic in my life, and I think in a better movie, with a better context, the twist could have been cool. Make no mistake, I was definitely very surprised when I saw it in the theater, but there's nothing on either side of the curtain that's worth looking at. In the foreground, you got Ben Kingsley as the Mandarin, who I just talked about, and in the background, there's Guy Pearce, who also brings nothing to the table, and his character is just, from both an acting standpoint and also just a character and writing standpoint. First of all, Guy Pearce doesn't really bring any kind of special personality to this role. Say what you want about Iron Man 2, but at least Sam Rockwell had a memorable personality as Justin Hammer, and at least Mickey Rourke was pretty memorable as Ivan Vanko. Whereas with this guy, Aldrich Killian, you're just told that he's the bad guy, and you have to accept that he's the bad guy because he's the bad guy. This is where a lot of the writing problems start to surface in the movie. Aldrich Killian's motives are barely explained, his abilities are barely explained, his goals are barely explained. What especially confused me while I was watching the movie is that the properties of that extremist experiment are never explained. Throughout the movie, you find out that Guy Pearce has been experimenting on people with physical deformities and giving them this sort of fire superhuman abilities, but it's never concretely explained to you what these people can do and what they're capable of and what kind of punishment they can take. I mean, yeah, you could say the same thing about the Avengers. You never really learn anything about the army of aliens that the team is fighting, but at least their abilities are consistent. But in Iron Man 3, Guy Pearce and his minions are just all over the place. Sometimes an explosion this big will kill them, and sometimes it won't. Sometimes they can regenerate body parts, and sometimes they can't. Sometimes they can breathe freaking fire, and sometimes they can't. And frankly, for a super genius scientist guy, Aldrich Killian is kind of an idiot. He kills his girlfriend for seemingly no reason, just sort of to establish himself as a big bad guy. And he also injects Pepper Potts with the extremist stuff. Why would you do that? I mean, yeah, it'll be painful for a time, and there is a chance that she could just violently explode, but there's also a chance that she could become an all-powerful fire demon and kill you. There's another scene from the trailers that looks awesome, but in the context of the movie is really stupid that I want to talk about, and that's the scene where Tony Stark threatens the Mandarin on national television. A while before Iron Man 3 was released in theaters, about 1 minute of that scene was released on the internet. You're sitting there watching this little 1-minute clip from the movie with no context, and Tony Stark just looks pissed. He's like, you know, there's no politics here, just good old-fashioned revenge, and it makes you think that something huge must have happened right before this scene. Maybe Pepper Potts was killed, or the Mandarin did something else terrible. But when you watch the movie, it's not like that at all. He's not mad about losing somebody important, God forbid, like Pepper Potts or Rhodey. He's mad about his bodyguard, Jon Favreau, being put in a coma. Temporarily. I know that Happy the Bodyguard is important to Tony, and he's been with Tony Stark for a long time, and they've become really good friends over the years, but I don't care about Happy, and I refuse to believe that Tony would give away his home address on national television and threaten a terrorist all for the sake of Jon Favreau. And that scene where Tony Stark is talking to the reporters and when he threatens the Mandarin pretty much solidifies him as a terrible person in this movie. I know that a huge part of Tony Stark's character is that he's reckless and impulsive, but in Iron Man 3 it goes way too far. He threatens a national terrorist and gives his home address away on national news with no backup plan or other tricks up his sleeve. That's stupid and selfish and incredibly inconsiderate. He ends up endangering his life and Pepper Potts' life and the other girl's life, and he never thinks about any of these things. He's a grown man and he never learns from his mistakes. Even by the end of the movie, he's still the same old good guy. Another thing that's really tricky with the universe Iron Man 3 is set in is that it takes place after the Avengers. Part of the reason the first Iron Man movie is so fantastic is because even though there's a bunch of crazy stuff going on in the movie, it's still grounded in reality. Even though there's an eccentric billionaire flying around on screen in a robot suit punching terrorists, you buy it because the context and the tone of the movie just make it feel real. And the same goes for all the crazy tech and gadgets that Tony Stark has. But in a way, Iron Man 1 sort of exists in its own self-contained universe because it was the first of all those Avengers movies. But Iron Man 3, unfortunately, takes place in a world where a giant super battle with gods and aliens and super soldiers took place in New York not long ago. So for Iron Man 3, in order to make the story plausible for the Marvel universe that now surrounds it, you have to make all the tech and gadgets and stuff like crazy. Again, this complaint isn't at the fault of anyone who contributed to making Iron Man 3, it's just sort of a consequence of a post-Avengers world. The trailers for Iron Man 3 made it look like a much darker movie than it actually is. It was sort of advertised as like the Dark Knight Rises of the Iron Man movies, but it's absolutely not. It is by far the goofiest, funniest, and most lighthearted of the Iron Man movies thus far. And the comedy in Iron Man 3 is completely out of place in the Iron Man movies, and it doesn't really fit. Iron Man 1 and 2 have a very specific sense of humor. Just about every single really funny moment in Iron Man 1 and 2 come from a character that's intentionally being funny. What I mean by that is that most of the times that you laugh at Tony Stark in Iron Man 1 or Iron Man 2, it's because he said something that he meant to be funny. He wanted you to laugh at it. Yeah, that style of humor is definitely there in Iron Man 3, but there's a lot more slapsticky, goofball, physical jokes than there needs to be. Iron Man 3 isn't as dark as it could be because every opportunity for a joke is exploited. The Avengers is a very goofy movie. It has a lot of slapsticky, physical humor type of stuff, but it also knows when to be serious. You know, it has its tense and dramatic moments. You're not always laughing in the Avengers. But I don't really think there's any scene in Iron Man 3 that's not a comedy scene. You never get a breather. You never get to sit down and just look at what's going on. Every scene is just jam-packed with stuff that's supposed to make you laugh, and most of it does make you laugh, but by the end of the movie, there's just been so much of it that it just makes you groan and protest. The last thing I want to talk about is the little post-credit Easter egg that all these Marvel Avengers movies have. It's just a little scene where you get to see Mark Ruffalo and Robert Downey Jr., and they crack a little joke, and that's the end of it. I mean, that scene is cool and all, and it was cool to see Mark Ruffalo, but you wanted to see, like, the Guardians of the Galaxy in the first post-credit scene for Phase 2, not this. You know, show us a little piece of something cool that's yet to come. Get us psyched for Phase 2. But nope, instead of something awesome, you get yet another throwaway joke. So that's Iron Man 3. I was very disappointed, but based on most of the reviews I've seen, it looks like I'm the minority. A lot of people seem to enjoy this movie, so I don't know. Take this review with a grain of salt. This video is going to be way too long, isn't it?